Chapter 5. Siding with bullies offers no protection, for you've still got to live with yourself. Unknown. There was another reason I wanted to go to Darwin besides the employment market being an employee's, not an employer's market. It's something I'm kind of ashamed of, but it's something that happens to me to get myself out of a hole. On my way around Oz, on the lap, I was still depressed about what had happened in that cursed warehouse. So I resorted to something that I haven't done for over a decade, mooning over a male. He lived in Darwin. I still had his fastbook details and I sent him a message expecting to end up in Darwin at the tail end of my lap. I apologized for how I treated him and said I was now sober. The message came back. Don't worry, darling, I wasn't myself back then either. I didn't ask any more questions in case he came back with his new happy life details, in a relationship or something. Ashamedly, I'd even checked out his pics, a different girl in each of them. I first met Frankie when I lived in Brownsville. I would say that he was the first way younger male that I'd been with. Frankie was 21. He'd been with a friend of mine since he was 19. Susie was my age, early 30s, so she was the OG cougar. I'd recently become friends with Susie, a very hardcore, no-nonsense woman who grew up in South Africa. I admired her strength. She and Frankie had broken up, and one night after an art exhibition opening, we'd somehow decided to walk home together. Before we got to the turnoff to my house, he threw me up against the wall and kissed me. Frankie was 6 feet, half Maori with short dreadlocks, and despite his ridiculous good looks, was quiet and humble. So this move out of the blue was a real turn-on. I got no misogynistic vibes from him. He was just honest. So we walked home to his instead. It was great sex. I was left feeling highly attracted to him. What would happen next was anyone's guess, so I didn't expect what happened next. We were all at the next art exhibition opening. Brownsville had fuck all non-bogan bars and hangs for the alternative crowd, so we went to the opening of an envelope if it involved the arts. I was playing it cool where Frankie was concerned. This made him wander around the exhibition, hiding behind sculptures and eyeing me intensely. It was a pretty hot move, and I hoped I'd get a repeat performance. But back then, I was still socially conditioned to let the male do all the seduction, in case I was perceived as too desperate. This cost me. Susie, who knew everything despite me not telling her, grabbed Frankie at the end of the exhibition. She drew him out into the night with a gravitational pull. I remember his face looking at me with longing as he followed her. He wanted me to grab him instead. This was a quandary. Susie wasn't with him but didn't want him to be with anyone else by the looks. I was very attracted to Susie platonically, so I wasn't going to fuck with the friendship. So no more Frankie. He seemed to leave town at some stage, and that was that. Jump forward a decade and I was living in Cairns. I ran into Frankie in the street. He was now living here. He had a girl with him. She looked pretty wrecked drug-wise. This gave me a little bit of hope, weirdly. I was still attracted to this early 30s version of him. He'd lost his dreads and was still slim but more solidly built with short hair. A real man now. The next time I saw him was at a groovy little bar. He was holding court with heaps of hipster males. I didn't like his bravado in front of these no doubt cockheads. Frankie was nicer alone. I don't know how we swapped details, but we did. I found myself in an awful relationship. I don't even want to describe the male. He was that dreadful. He wasn't violent, just manipulative. And I was kind of using him, having left my teaching job because of bullying, and then having to give up my cool inner city apartment. I'd moved in with him. I'm sure my bad choice was because of the bullying. Anyway, one day I decided to contact Frankie. We met at that same groovy bar for drinks, then toddled to another groovy bar that served food. The shoe was on the other foot now. Frankie was single and I wasn't. I was in such a state of hopelessness about this cockhead that I hit up Frankie for a round 2 of the session all those years ago. He declined, saying it was because I was in a relationship. Fair enough. I went back home feeling better for having Frankie gaze at me longingly across the table. The next time we organised to hang out, I'd rid myself of the cockhead and was back living in the caravan park I'd originally moved to when I'd first come to Cairns. I'd sold my big 18-foot 80s caravan that I'd done up and was living in an unregistered old high-ace camper. This time I could tell Frankie was expecting that we'd leave together. I don't know why I didn't. He waited with me for my bus back to the van park. A drunk backpacker started talking to us, a Brit. He asked if we were together, and Frankie and I replied that we were just friends. The Brit decided that I was available, so put his arm around me and pretended to pull me away. Frankie didn't step up, and I get it, because I laughed it off. But that was Frankie, too gentle. I really should have gone home with him that night. Jump forward again, and I was planning on moving to Melbourne. I'd done nearly a year doing market stalls in the Byron area, then Sydney. A friend must have told me that Frankie was in Melbourne, living with his gay older brother Manuel. I contacted him on FB again, and he invited me to come visit him. This time, in Manuel's flash Caulfield Terrace, I decided to take matters into my own hands. We were all watching TV, and I said I was going to bed. Instead of going to my van, I went upstairs to Frankie's room. It was a bold move for me, but it paid off. Frankie came up a bit later, and we finally got down to round 2 after a decade of thwarted opportunities. He whispered in my ear while we were in the throes. "Remember this?" I sure did. Frankie and I fit together as lovers. Plus I had a bed to stay in instead of the van. It was good times for a few months. We'd go camping when we weren't making lots of sex noise in Manuel's apartment. One night he and his boyfriend got noisy, and Frankie said, "That's because of us, he's getting revenge." I hated how loud I got, but I couldn't help it. It usually helped me get there. The only downside of sex with Frankie was I could never come. He had an average sized dick, but it was slim like him. It didn't stop me from being ready for him whenever he'd coax me into having sex in all sorts of places. We fucked on a rock in the mountain stream that had signs saying Melbourne water. I let him rely on withdrawal, so Frankie jizzed in Melbourne drinking water. It was pretty funny. I loved being with Frankie. I'd say I was even in love with him. When we'd go for food, he loved his foodie food. He'd gaze at me with such longing while surreptitiously pinching my love handles. I was in peak body condition then. My alcohol days ironically had me looking my best. It was because of this that I left him one day. It wasn't only the booze paranoia. On our way back to Melbourne, after staying in a van park cabin that belonged to one of his friends from Brownsville days, he said something that really disappointed me. "You know that I really want a relationship and kids." He didn't need to say the next part. I was just a placeholder till he found a young, fertile female. I didn't react to this. Later, when I'd made a friend, Emma, at one of the regular Melbourne markets I frequented, I told her the whole Frankie story. She agreed it was shit of him. It's not nice, but I wanted to say to him, no young woman who's looking to start a family is going to choose you. You don't drive, you work as a dishy, and your pot addiction all spelled deadbeat dad. I knew he was hoping for a woman to turn his life around. And it was so confusing because he was so happy with me. I figured he was just pushing me away because I was pushing him away first. So on New Year's Eve, when we'd planned to meet up after his restaurant shift, I jumped ship, as he put it later. I stayed at Emma's from then on. My heartache over Frankie lasted a while. So when he contacted me a few months later, wanting me to come visit him in his student-subsidised city studio apartment, I went. When I showed up, Frankie didn't wait for me to get out of my van. He cradled my waist in his arms and lay his head on my lap. It was so sweet. I was not at my best though. I was carrying a torch for this revolting Tinder match I'd seen a few times. A naval guy, my age, who I'd hooked up with on my trip to Cairns to catch the dry season markets. More on him later. The reason Frankie wanted me to come over was he'd locked himself out of his apartment. We waited for the locksmith and I ended up paying him. I should have been pissed off, but Frankie was hopeless like that. Not malicious. I wanted him so badly. I wanted to use him to get over the Navy arsehole. He insisted we wait while he prepared some food he'd swiped from the restaurant. While we waited for the food to cook, I lay on his single bed and he lay his whole body over the top of me, covering me. Despite being way heavier than me, I wasn't squashed. I loved the feeling. He eventually squished me. I slept the night in his single bed and woke up numb from being wedged up against the wall. I remember how he laughed at me as I fell out of bed, trying hard to get feeling back in my body. He never contacted me again, and I sent him an angry message about paying me back for the locksmith. I figured he'd gotten revenge on me for jumping ship. I wasn't even that angry with him, more hurt. But I took my frustration about the Navy arsehole out on him in the form of a drunken FB message. So there was reason to apologise. I hadn't been to Darwin since I was 21, living in Sydney and having a real interest in Indigenous culture. I'd stayed with my uncle and aunt and my two cousins. This time round, my aunt had passed away that year, and Harry was haunting a big, lovely, stone-tiled house on acreage. It even had a little plunge pool and a large, louvered, closed-in patio out the back. It wasn't easy at Harry's. Well, correction, I didn't make it easy. I expressed my left-wing views on Trump and all sorts of other hoo-ha that came on the news. Harry argued back. He believed Trump was good for the US, for the world, for the markets. All boomers were so predictable. Nevertheless, I hated how argumentative and sarcastic I was towards him. In hindsight, I was probably still reeling from having to be nice to Bluey. Harry was not that sexist, racist, homophobic person, but it frustrates me that he decides to be in that same camp. When it came to Frankie, I promised myself that I'd only contact him if I got a job. Then, if it turned out he was in a relationship, it'd be good to have a friend in Darwin. And it'd look like I wasn't coming to Darwin for him, just for a job in the busy dry season. I set about looking for one as soon as possible. Every truck and van driving job I saw online required an NT license. I really couldn't swap my license and rego over to the Northern Territory. So I went around and asked all the courier mobs if they wanted an extra van and driver for the dry season. The little companies said they only had enough work for themselves, with no need for casual workers. And the big national companies just told me to submit a resume. That's one thing I love about being a courier. Because I own a van, they generally hire me on the spot without having to go through that resume bullshit. My references were scant, and the ones I had, I hated asking. So I gave up. I spent a fair bit of time away from Harry, since it was tense. I went driving and camping in Kakadu. What a place. Crocs galore, as well as tourists. But I always found a camp. I was in one of these by a flowing river. I went to the croc viewing platform and could see some on the banks further upriver. I decided to do what we used to do as young'uns living on the banks of a croc-infested river on the Coaltown cattle property. I walked along the bank to drive them all into the water. I carefully eyed the one I'd seen from the platform, while also keeping careful watch of the land to my left. If you see a croc more than a metre away from the bank and you're between it and the river, it's probably nesting, and it's time to run. As I walked along, I saw swishes in the corner of my eye. There were even more crocs disguised as logs along the riverbank. They all ran into the water. When I made it up to where a curve in the river was visible, there were so many. I turned and ran back to the viewing platform. They weren't dangerous, just freshies, but still sizable. I watched from the platform as they all made their way back onto the riverbank. At least 10. The escape into the water was both for predicted danger to them and to lay in the shallows and see if what was on the bank was worth hunting. It's a risky game, but I loved it. I went back to the van and decided to brew up some mushroom tea. I hadn't had a chance to drop my microdoses. In retrospect, I should have. It would have made me more easy to live with for poor Harry. I figured the mushies were weak, so I had a full cup of the tea. There was at least another cup left in the brew. I waited, sitting in the van, listening to music on headphones. And then it came, and it was strong. Because I'd chosen to partake in the daylight, I knew I wouldn't hallucinate. I just got that dreamy, Valium-esque body stone. Those things were happening in my mind as well. Music got more beautiful, even though it was dark gangster trap and drill. I sat cross-legged on my little bed and danced from my waist up, waving my arms around like a hippie to strong 808 beats. I felt good. I felt happy. Mushies always make me sleep well, and I looked forward to that at night. On dusk, I went down and watched all the southern tourists fishing on a causeway covered in water. I spoke to a woman who was, predictably, from Melbourne. She said that her and her partner come up here every year. Kind of annoying how these people claim a holiday place as their own. The reason being what she said next. There's a pesky croc hanging around. See it in the water over there? I did indeed see it, an actual salty, and a large one too, looking like a log floating on the water. This was the croc's feeding point. It had more right to be there, and these people were trying to steal its barra. Except they weren't. The woman said they hadn't caught anything all day. Sucked in. I started to look around me more cautiously, standing ankle deep on the causeway. This was how tourists got grabbed by crocs, as they could still crawl around to the water on the other side. I reasoned that by pure numbers of people there, I'd be pretty safe. And then I saw something just plain stupid. A guy had a little car parked near where he was fishing on the other side of the causeway. He was probably a Territorian since he wasn't in an expensive four-wheel drive cruiser. He caught a barra and walked onto the rocky bank, covered in water and slime, to net it as he pulled it up. The croc came right up close to him, but he wasn't perturbed. I almost couldn't watch. These fishing addicts really put themselves in danger. I went back to my van. I did Litchfield National Park next, staying at a place that mines zebra stones. Such a nice woman running the show. More beautiful springs to be found there. I didn't mention that I did Gorgetown Springs with Lee and the boys and this awesome friend of hers, a doctor. It was a day without Bluey and we all enjoyed ourselves. The springs were 10 out of 10 also. There was no need to look up Frankie for some holiday fun or something more permanent, as my stupid daydreaming had led me to. There were hundreds of US military males in town. A quick look on Tinder and they were most certainly on there. In fact, you could just walk down the main street of Darwin and see them all in groups. I matched with several and tried to organise a port in a storm for myself. It was very easy because A, their base was within 2 kilometres of Harry's acreage block, and B, they were all young, horny and very open to hook up since they weren't here long. But let's face it, most young males on Tinder were there for nothing permanent, even the ones who claimed to want a long-term relationship. I got lucky, literally. There were a lot to choose from, but some of them made the choice easy. One eggplant emoji with not even a "how are you?" I guess black US soldiers are as bad as young skippy morons. The one I chose did the bare minimum by chatting to me first. I seriously don't understand why they don't all do this. I like a chat, so I can determine if they're disrespectful or not. But I could be the nutter, so they should suss me out as much as I suss them. Protect yourselves, kids. They have no sense. When I went to pick him up, he was a lot smaller than his pics gave away. In fact, there were so many short kings in the US military. I'm into short guys if they're cute in the face. I like them for safety. I'd have a fighting chance with them if they turn nasty, or so I told myself. He was so polite and modest. The US military really made polite men out of some of those boys. Something that definitely isn't taught in the Oz military. They're mostly too untouchably confident, safe in the knowledge that their predatory behaviour isn't handled by non-military police. I'd got us a nice hotel room in the city. This was more of an apartment than just a room. We both walked around the space appreciating it because we both lived in small quarters. I love a guy who doesn't just launch onto me, sucking face. He was quite gorgeous the way he did it. For some reason, reception rang the room to see if everything was okay. I was standing, talking on the phone, and he slid into the chair right near me. So when I put the receiver down, I had no option but to look down into his face. I love a shy guy with moves. I smiled at his game, took his face in my hands, and we were away. He was strong from all the working out that he did. His shoulder width was almost too wide for his height, but it was also perfect in the way he could pick me up and carry me to the couch. After some very hot making out, I asked if he wanted to eat the takeaway that we'd bought. The answer was naturally no. He then carried me again to the bed. My soldier boy was a considerate lover. Despite his horniness, he didn't pound my pelvis to achieve his own ends. In fact, he seemed to be holding himself back a bit. Probably because he was like most young males these days. Their bodies are programmed to come quickly from internet porn, and it gave them stamina issues. He'd obviously overcome this, as he lasted the distance. As a reward, I rode him home while giving him orders to succumb to his own pleasure. Man, I've got the sense of humour of a teenage boy. And because he was young, we could do round two. Laying in bed, watching terrible TV, it got a bit awkward at times. He was interested in my life and asked me lots of questions. I don't think he understood why I'd want to live my life the way I did. He didn't voice this, but I got the feeling that he thought I was lonely. Of course he was right, but the main thing is I really didn't expect these sex sessions to cure that loneliness. He was quite a sensitive person with a big family who obviously loved and supported him. I liked his curiosity. He was well-rounded. I put the awkwardness down to our age gap. He had things to do, and sitting in this hotel room with a stranger watching TV was not one of them. I felt a little regretful when he decided to leave, saying that a friend of his was coming to town and he should go home with him. They weren't allowed out on their own, only in pairs. It was a compliment that he'd broken rules to see me. I lay in bed, still naked, while he dressed and got ready to go. He hung back for a while, watching TV like he was expecting something. I couldn't read him, so I stayed silent. He got the hint and headed out. He was an interesting person and he changed my blanket attitude on US males. I stood on the balcony and smoked a cigarette. Down in a side street, I saw two Asian women talking to a black guy who looked just like him, though it was too far away to tell. They were at the back entrance to a massage place. A back entrance usually meant erotic massage. He told me that they were banned from these places and to get busted going to them meant punishment. I wasn't sure if it was him, but if it was, he sure had a ton of libido to burn through. Or he just didn't like sex with me and was looking for something better. Either way, why should I care? I got mine. And if you get a respectful one, that's a rarity these days. I decided to go free camping in the city the night after my hotel stay. I didn't feel like going back to Harry's straight away. At Mindle Beach, I saw a trio of vans. I rolled up on them and asked if they were camping there. Their answer was no. They were very friendly people though. An older Aussie guy who was very into Indigenous stuff urged us all to go to the NAIDOC March and markets on Monday. Sure, why not? The other two were Israelis. They weren't travelling together, they just ended up in the same place. The woman was in her 20s, tall and fierce looking, though she was very friendly. The guy was in his 30s and told me all about where to go camp. Apparently there was a bush block right near the airport. They were off to get some food, so I decided to go case out this place. It was a huge patch of land with lots of tall trees and amazingly no ground cover in the shape of weeds and vines. I parked near to the road, across from all the people parked up watching planes take off. Plane spotters. There was another car nearby and they packed up and left when I showed up. Who knew what that was about? My van doesn't look scary. It's an Iveco Daily and just looks like a mechanic's or tradies van. I guess it could have a surveillance van look if you were paranoid enough. Anyway, I couldn't see these people yet, so I locked myself in and tucked myself up for the night. It was surprisingly peaceful. I was glad to be near traffic just in case someone tried to break in. At least there'd be witnesses. The next morning I drove around a bit and found the Israelis up the back of the block squeezed in between trees. The girl had one of those expensive rental vans, a high-top Hi-Ace. The bloke was making do with a car and a rooftop tent. I admired people who camped in those things. You're really open to everyone without a vehicle to lock yourself into. I don't know what came over me, but I invited them to come camp at Harry's. I'd have to ask him first, but I figured it'd remedy my previous rants about Palestine and how bad the Israelis are. I'd bring a couple round. I got their numbers and took off to go get some creature comforts. A bed, a kitchen, a telly. Harry was accommodating, probably because they were Israelis. I only texted the girl, expecting her to let the bloke know. She showed up, dressed up, which I didn't expect. Thea was originally from Georgia. Her parents had moved her out of there when she was a teenager because of the quality of life they had. She'd managed to get out of the IDF compulsory service by becoming a police officer. She'd done her time with being a cop as well and seemed to be on a sabbatical to sort herself out. She'd missed October 7, but knew people involved. Quite a commanding presence, which I put down to being a cop. so I was surprised to see her turn up in a boob tube that barely covered everything. Thea and Harry got right into it early. They discussed the anti-Semitism of pro-Palestinian movements, how Palestine doesn't really exist. Thea added that the word Palestine is a joke. It had a meaning that I can't even remember because I was a bit shocked. I shouldn't have been. I expected all this. Harry was in his element. I did try to add my bit by pointing out that there's resources under the land occupied by Palestinians, and this is really what's behind Netanyahu's offensive. Thea gained a bit of favour with me by saying that she didn't like Netanyahu. Well, put your money where your mouth is then and admit that he's a genocidal maniac. She wasn't going to go that far. Later on, when we were both helping her set up her van with extension cords, something inevitable happened. Her boob tube slipped right down in front of Harry. I didn't see it, I just heard Harry laugh and say, "Whoops," I didn't know where to look. Harry's no dashing middle-aged man. I wondered if this was Thea's go-to around males in general. Maybe she got free beds out of it on her travels. I didn't blame her. I thought it was pretty humorous also. I doubted she was going to get that kind of free bed out of Harry. His reaction kind of confirmed a suspicion I'd had about him anyway. It was a nice suspicion, and it made my whole view of him change. I felt empathy for the poor guy now. I was watching Netflix with him one night when I'd first arrived. I was scrolling down through the categories and I accidentally started rolling through his continue watching shows and movies. There was a doco on there about gay cowboys. I paused on it to read about it. I suddenly realized I was in continue watching and I quickly scrolled out of the list. I could feel Harry's uneasiness to my left even without looking at him. Wow. This would make so much sense. My aunt, his wife, was a very masculine-looking woman who barely wore makeup. They didn't have the best relationship, though Harry had nursed her till her death. I also remember him mentioning to me, when I offered my sympathy about my aunt, that his best mate had died a short while after her, so his wife wasn't his best mate. He seemed to be sadder about this bloke. There was a lot of things about Harry that were probably a cover for his sexuality. Harry was very into guns. He was a regular gun club enthusiast and had even won heaps of ribbons that were up on the lounge room wall. This could have been to try and have some common ground with his father, my grandfather. That poor bloke was very aloof, but he had a reason. His mother had shot herself when my grandfather was 9. It was weird that he had an obsession with guns as an adult, but who knows how grief affects people. I know I was probably reading into Harry. He could have just liked guns. There was something about his masculinity that seemed forced. After our little Netflix encounter, something about Harry's attitude to me changed. He talked about how all the women in his street got together and did walking, and he would come along. They'd ask him to join their Pilates class. Harry asked me what I thought of Pilates, and I loved that he was talking to me about this, like I was one of the girls. I told him to go for it. He'd probably be the only male Pilates student in the whole territory, and I hoped he'd get past the stigma and give it a go. If true, I really felt sorry for Harry for having to live a lie. My grandmother, his mother, was a strong influence on him, and I believe that she'd have been open-minded enough to accept him. Perhaps it was just my grandfather's opinion that kept him in the closet. I really didn't know anything, and there was no way I'd ask. In some ways, I was even more angry about Harry's right-wing leanings. He was siding with the bullies, the ones who wouldn't push for his rights if he were a gay man. I guess he had the best of both worlds, with liberal attitudes and his female friends. Even my aunt had been very pro-Labour, and probably would have accepted it and encouraged his life. I felt sorry for her too. I don't think she was gay, she was just a tough Territorian woman who didn't like dresses. The next morning, Tia and I headed off to the city for the NAIDOC March. I went on my motorcycle and I waited around for Tia to meet me under a huge, beautiful rain tree. I loved how Darwin had all the vegetation of Cairns City. Tropical cities really do defy the concrete jungles of other climates. I started chatting to an Aboriginal woman about how my friend was finding it hard to pay for parking, being an OS traveller, and that I was downloading the app to pay for it for her. She agreed it was a ridiculous system. I was turned towards her and she looked over my shoulder and said, Here's your mate now. She must have guessed because we both didn't look indigenous, but we were both similarly brown white people. And Thea had shown up in similarly sexy attire as at Harry's. Thankfully, she had on a shirt to cover her shoulders from the sun, and also to show a bit of respect to the culture, although I don't think that's why she covered up. I got the obvious vibe about Thea very early on in the march. We hung out the back of the crowd and I was relieved we did. All of a sudden, Thea launched into this rant about how, when she was a copper, she'd arrested a black guy. He then turned around and accused her and the other officers of racism. I surmised that she'd lost her patience when we had waited so long standing up for the march to begin. She let forth her whole belief system about how some groups of people blame everyone else except themselves, victim mentality, etc., etc. It was pretty embarrassing to say the least. And then she let drop something that I found quite a valuable piece of info. When I moved to Israel, they used to call us Russian sluts, but I didn't let that get to me. She was so cranky and it was obvious that she was kicking down to make herself feel better, rather than kicking at the actual bullies. Her admission had confirmed an attitude among some Israelis that I'd suspected. There are pockets of segregation that ignore the fact that those of different nationality are still Jewish. I was pretty certain that Black Eye had indeed suffered racism in Israel. These people were culturally separatist. Their religion wasn't a unifier. So of course they had no tolerance for people who looked different from them physically and were a different religion. The TikToks I've seen of Israelis mocking Palestinians by drawing monobrows on them were pure childishness. I was relieved when the march ended and I hugged Thea and wished her well on her journey. I also ran into the Israeli bloke while I was walking around the markets afterwards. He was a gentle character. Thea hadn't told him about Harry's because she was sick of him. She said he was too clingy and relying on her decision-making too much. A male who realised women were better at planning seemed to have good characteristics to me, but I'm an older woman who doesn't desire an alpha bro like my aggressive friend Thea probably did. That unfortunate tendency that we all have in our 20s when we're travelling solo in a difficult world that claims to adore young women but seeks to exploit them at every opportunity. I could see her ending up with an IDF arsehole who'd probably abuse her due to being fucked up from his service. I don't know, but I know enough to know that could happen. A couple of nights later and I found myself in the middle of cracker night. The Territory is the only state in Australia where this is legalised, and it really says it all about the NT. My cousin, Harry's eldest daughter, came over with her husband and 2 sons, and with about $200 worth of firecrackers. I absolutely loved it, running in and lighting them up like a kid, but I felt for parents on this night. My cousin's husband spent his time gently chiding his son to be careful and not stand on the wooden sheet that acted as the launching pad. If a foot went on the sheet, it could tip the firework and it would shoot out at all of us gathered round, despite the safe distance we had. Luckily, nothing bad happened, but I got the feeling that that wouldn't have been everyone's experience of the night. What a crazy, dangerous pastime. I'm sure they were all proud of their rebellious attitude to OH&S. And it was almost a different country, this Northern Territory place. I guess it's closer to Asia than to the capital, Canberra, so it's always held customs that you don't find anywhere else. Ironically, because of Canberra's territory status as the ACT, it used to have Cracker Night also. Predictably, it dropped it, due to being the centre where so much OH&S legislation is written. It was during this night that I got a bit of a chance to have a cheeky shot at Harry. I relayed to my cousin my whole day at NAIDOC, focusing on my cringiness when Thea started to go off about people of colour needing to pull themselves out of their victimhood. She was pretty appalled. My cousin works for the Department of Education and carries the torch her mother left by being very progressive in her politics. I then told her about Thea's account of being racially abused and slut-shamed by the Israelis. My cuz was definitely on my wavelength about this. We didn't say the quiet part out loud, but she understood when it came to the disgusting attitude of some Israelis towards Thea, and her lack of understanding towards people in the firing line, despite her being in the firing line at one stage herself. My uncle was sitting right next to my cuz. He didn't counteract this with his own opinion. I know it wouldn't have changed his, but it was good for him to know. The rest of the Darwin trip was pretty uneventful. I got up on Harry's roof and threw down all the dead firecrackers, plus cleared so many more off the driveway. I even cleaned his solar panels while I was up there, so I went up in Harry's estimation, I think. I also worked on my motorcycle and put a tin plate to cover where the seat went. This was because I was fixing a retro tractor-style seat onto the bike. It sat up high on springs. I used tiny jewelry pliers to rotate the screws that sat inside the spring by tiny 30-degree turns. Took me ages. I really hoped I wouldn't need to get into the battery anytime soon. What a job. It looked shit hot though. Because I wanted a truck driving, or at the very least a tractor driving job, Darwin wasn't for me. I was disappointed as I'd been looking forward to having a place to live, to making some money, doing a hard physical job that calmed me down, to sampling more US soldiers, to seeing Frankie. I love this about myself though. I don't hang around where I'm not wanted. Maybe I fly the scene too fast. I've also stayed too long in situations that were bringing me down. Broome was originally on my list of must-sees when I did the failed lap, and when I'd stayed in the Zebrastone van park in Litchfield, the lovely owner who'd lived there before said I should try Miriwong for work. She even told me to go to the farming co-op there and they'd help me find work. I didn't think I'd end up in a tiny, quiet farming town driving heavy machinery for a season, but I had to give this option a go. Little did I know that Miriwong was not quiet, or little for that matter, so I set off.